In 2023, seeking solitude after a falling out with my dad, I sublet a small cabin from a man I'll call my landlord. Nestled at the end of a dirt road in Taiwan's Taichung City's Baitan district, this cabin promised peace, but instead delivered a chilling experience. I had been there for a month when one night, after a long 12-hour shift, I returned home, exhausted. After a simple dinner, I climbed up to the bedroom and shut the quirky hatch door behind me, something I did every night for a sense of security. I was watching TV in bed when I heard it. A voice from below. "Who's up there?" My heart stopped. It sounded like it was coming from inside the cabin. I turned off the TV, peered through the small circular window, but saw nothing in the pitch-black darkness. Gathering my courage, I called out, "Who's there?" Silence. I opened the hatch and looked down the staircase. I even called my dad's name, hoping it was him. No response. The living room was empty, the front yard deserted. Back in bed, I tried to shake it off as my imagination, but then, loud pounding on the hatch door made me freeze. Someone was in the house. I was too terrified to move, knowing the hatch door had no lock. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to find my phone, only to realize it was downstairs. I crept down, grabbing my phone from the car, but when I returned, the nightmare worsened. Sitting on my bed was a man, staring at the TV. He turned slowly to face me. I screamed and bolted, locking myself in the car and calling 911. The police arrived and searched the cabin. Finding no one, they advised me to stay elsewhere, so I returned to my dad's house for the night. The next day, I packed up and moved out. The landlord, suspiciously unfazed, refunded part of my rent without question. To this day, the memory of that night haunts me. Was it a prank? Or was there something more sinister lurking in that cabin? One thing is certain: I'll never seek solitude in the woods again.
I am Jack, an ordinary American. That year, I was on a business trip to Japan, primarily to negotiate an important deal. The schedule was tight, with hardly any free time. The company had arranged for me to stay at a high-end hotel in central Tokyo called Ikari Hotel. I arrived at the hotel on a rainy night. It was late, and the streets were glowing with neon lights, the rain reflecting eerie colors. The receptionist greeted me in fluent English and handed me a room key.
"Sir, you're staying on the 14th floor, room 1408. Enjoy your stay,"
she said with a smile. I took the key and headed to the elevator. As the doors opened on the 14th floor, a strange chill ran down my spine. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by a few flickering wall lamps. I walked to room 1408, inserted the key card, and the door unlocked with a click. The room was spacious and elegantly decorated, everything seemed perfect. However, the room felt colder than the rest of the hotel. I set my luggage down and went to the window, gazing at the night view of Tokyo. Suddenly, I saw a faint reflection, a shadowy figure that vanished as quickly as it appeared. I turned around, but the room was empty. "Jack, you must be exhausted," I muttered to myself. I decided to take a hot shower to relax. The warmth of the water finally chased away the chill. After my shower, I put on a robe and walked back to the bedroom, only to hear a faint sobbing. My heart skipped a beat. It seemed to come from under the bed. I crouched down and shone my flashlight under the bed, but there was nothing. Was it just my imagination? Shaking my head, I climbed into bed and tried to sleep. But the sobbing started again, clearer this time. It was a low, mournful sound, like it came from another world. "Who's there?" I called out. The sobbing stopped abruptly, and the room was silent again. Feeling unnerved, I reached for the phone to call the front desk, but there was no signal. With no other choice, I tried to fall asleep again. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by an icy touch. I opened my eyes and saw a pale woman standing by the bed, her eyes vacant and her face streaked with tears. I screamed and jumped out of bed, turning on the lights, but she was gone. I realized I might be experiencing something supernatural. I recalled hearing urban legends about this hotel, where many guests claimed to have encountered strange occurrences, especially on the 14th floor. I can't stay here any longer, I thought, deciding to leave the room immediately. I quickly packed my bags and opened the door, but what I saw in the hallway made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in fresh blood, with the word, "Help," written everywhere. The stench was overwhelming. I ran to the elevator, but no matter how many times I pressed the button, it wouldn't respond. At that moment, a shadow appeared at the end of the corridor, slowly approaching me. I recognized her as the woman from my room, her lifeless eyes fixed on me. I turned and ran to the stairwell, only to find the door locked tight. With the woman closing in, I remembered the small Bible I carried with me. I opened it and started reading a prayer aloud. Miraculously, her figure began to fade, eventually vanishing completely. Gasping for breath, I managed to open the stairwell door and ran down to the lobby. I rushed to the front desk, nearly in tears, pleading for help. The receptionist looked terrified as she listened to my story.
Sir, are you okay?
She asked, her face pale. That room. 1408, it's haunted. I exclaimed. Her face grew even paler.
Sir, I shouldn't be telling you this, but that room does have a history. 3 years ago, a woman committed suicide there, and her spirit has been trapped ever since.
Hearing this, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The manager arrived, apologizing profusely and arranging for a different room. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I checked out and left the hotel. Although time has passed, the memory of that night still sends chills down my spine. To this day, I haven't had the courage to stay at that hotel again. That terrifying experience remains a permanent nightmare in my mind.
Many years ago, I experienced an event that I still can't forget. I was a freshman at a small college in the Midwest. It was around October, and the fall semester was in full swing. Our dormitory was a classic, red brick building with ivy creeping up its walls. I lived on the 5th floor, in room 501, with 3 other guys. The events I'm about to recount happened right next door, in room 504, and they still send chills down my spine. It was nearly midnight. My roommates and I were already in bed, drifting off to sleep, when there was a frantic knocking on our door. Startled, I got up to answer it and found my friend Jake from 504 standing there, pale and wide-eyed. "Help, please, help us," he gasped. We quickly followed him to his room. Inside, the scene was chaos. One of their roommates, Nate, was halfway out the window, one leg dangling outside, the other hooked over the sill. His arms were flailing as his 2 roommates, Kevin and Mike, tried to pull him back in. "There's water outside. I need to get to the water," Nate kept screaming, his eyes wild and unseeing. Together, we managed to haul Nate back inside. He was still raving about the water outside the window, completely delirious. We decided to take him to our room where we had an empty bed. We laid him down and tried to calm him. Gradually, Nate's agitation lessened, but he kept pointing to our window, mumbling about the water. We gave him some water to drink, hoping it might soothe him. After a while, he seemed to settle down. "I'm okay now. I just need to use the bathroom," Nate said, his voice sounding more normal. We were worried he might try to hurt himself again, so we decided to accompany him. The dorm hallways were eerily quiet, and our flashlight cast long, creepy shadows as we made our way to the bathroom. Just as Nate was inside one of the stalls, the door to another stall creaked open on its own. We all froze. The bathroom had no windows, just a small ventilation fan. How did the door open by itself? One of my roommates, Tom, shone his flashlight into the stall. It was empty. We were thoroughly spooked. Nate finished and came out, seemingly unfazed by the eerie occurrence. We returned to our room, and he climbed back into the empty bed, falling asleep almost immediately. It was strange, because Nate was not known for falling asleep quickly, especially after such a terrifying ordeal. Tom and I stayed up, talking in hushed tones about what had happened. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Suddenly, Nate sat up in bed, his eyes wide open but unseeing. He began to choke himself, screaming, "Get off me! Get off me!" We rushed to him, prying his hands away from his throat. I ran downstairs to get the resident advisor. When we returned, Nate had calmed down, lying quietly as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I asked Nate what he remembered. He said he had fallen asleep quickly and had a vivid dream. In his dream, a tall figure dressed in black had sat on his bed, its head nearly touching the ceiling. The figure had no face, but it spoke to him, telling him to stay away from room 504. If he or anyone else went back there, it would take their lives. Later that day, we all decided not to return to our dorm rooms that night. We stayed with friends in other dorms. The events of that night were too unsettling. The next morning, we learned that Nate had disappeared. The entire dorm was searched, and eventually, the police were called. Nate was found at dawn, lying on a grave in the small cemetery behind the dorm. He was asleep. Unharmed but deeply shaken, he had no memory of how he got there. Afterward, the school allowed Nate to take a leave of absence. He recovered, but he never returned to our dorm. The story of that night spread through the campus, and no one wanted to stay in room 504 again. Years later, I heard from an alumnus that the dorm had a dark history. Many years before, a student had died under mysterious circumstances in room 504. Some said he had been pushed out the window. Others whispered of a dark presence that lingered in the room. Whatever the truth, I know one thing for certain. I will never forget the haunting of room 504.